Julie here. Before we get started, I want to tell you something I'm on a quest for these days. It's to bring my transformative experience as a mother, the coaching skills I've developed over a decade, and all the lessons I'm learning here on the podcast to work one-on-one with women ready to live a more epic life. If this is you, visit mothersquest.com to sign up for a free discovery session, and we can explore how coaching with me could support you on your quest. Now, on to the show. Hi, and welcome to Mother's Quest, a podcast for moms like me ready to live our own truly epic life. I'm Julie Neal, a life and leadership coach, community builder, writer, and mom to two high-energy boys who challenge me to grow into my best self. I'll be right there. Where was I? In the months leading up to a big milestone birthday, I decided it was time to stop sidelining my dreams and realize that I'm the hero of my own journey. I knew I didn't want to do it alone, so I created this podcast to learn from other moms on their own quest, so their words of wisdom and lessons learned could help light the way for mine. I created this podcast for myself. Come along with me, and you'll find some treasures of your own. Hello, and welcome to this episode number 24 of the Mother's Quest podcast. I'm so honored to bring you this important and powerful conversation today with Elizabeth Cronise McLaughlin, who through her daily resistance lives on Facebook guides thousands of us with a voice of reason and optimism during the twists and turns of today's political landscape. Known as a celebrated career coach and fearless entrepreneur, Elizabeth, a graduate of Carnegie Mellon University with a JD from George Washington University Law School, transitioned from a 15-year career as a Wall Street securities litigator and trial lawyer to found the Gaia Project for Women's Leadership. The organization offers virtual and live programming that cultivates leaders from the ground up to grow what they call New Paradigm Women's Leadership. Elizabeth is also a mindful mother. No matter how full her life gets, leading women around the globe or fighting for democracy, she prioritizes bringing presence and focus to her two children, both under 5. Before I tell you more about my conversation with Elizabeth, I want to share this week's dedication brought to you by a friend from my past, who I've reconnected with through activism this last year, Jen Jenkins Donor. Inspired one day by Elizabeth's impassioned call for unity, Jen created a piece of art that found its way onto Elizabeth's feed, and an opportunity began for Jen to step into her own heroine's journey as a resistance artist. You can find Jen's beautiful work, the proceeds of which go to causes represented in each piece, through the link in the show notes. Here's Jen with her dedication.
Thank you, Julie, for the opportunity to dedicate this podcast. My name is Jen Jenkins Donor, and I'm coming to you quite literally from my happy place, Lido Bay on the Delta in Discovery Bay, California. I am, as we speak, sitting on the dock of the bay. Julie and I worked in a different magical such place one summer in our burgeoning youth. A third sacred space Julie, my mom Ginger, and I have relied on for our very sanity in recent months is the daily Resistance Live broadcasts of Elizabeth Cronise McLaughlin. She has created an atmosphere of open awareness and intelligent optimism in this anything but normal political era we live through in America today. It was fulfilling to be able to share the historical and powerful experience of intersectionality with my mom at the Women's March in January. And it's similarly uplifting to share these daily Facebook Live broadcasts with her as well. Since I'm visiting her right now, we've been watching them together. There is something very full circle about sitting with the woman who taught me girls can do anything and watching together while it actually happens. So, I dedicate this Mother's Quest podcast to my mom, Ginger Jenkins. Thanks, Mom. It's true. We really can do anything.
Thank you, Jen, for that dedication to your mother and for how you thoughtfully articulated your experience of Elizabeth. Elizabeth brings the same open awareness and intelligent optimism you described to our conversation. We talk about how Elizabeth grew up in a very progressive community and had a strong intuition she would grow to make a massive difference in the world. She attended her first protest when she was just 15 years old, and now she's leading a new awakening in activism, one that challenges her over 20,000 followers, of which I am one, to take daily political action, to truly listen to one another and to others with differing perspectives, and move forward as intersectional feminists, shoulder to shoulder. We also talk about the new heroine's journey, where the heroine brings back the lessons learned with every step. Elizabeth's words of wisdom for me as I set out to raise awareness and create space for uncomfortable but important conversations about race and allyship. How we can bear witness for those who have different experiences than our own, and Elizabeth's challenge to all of us to use our voice for change. We packed so much depth and wisdom in this conversation, including the first ever lightning round exploration of the E.P.I.C guideposts. I look forward to hearing about the ways in which this episode will inspire you, and invite you to join the Mother's Quest Facebook group to share with us and participate in a special Q&A on Thursday, August 3rd at 11:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time with activist, leadership specialist, and former NAACP Vice President Chandra Brooks. I left this conversation feeling more inspired than ever to step up and into the role of the new heroine myself during these times. Moved by my experience with Elizabeth, I commit to daily action, to stretch myself to have brave conversations and use my voice for change, to truly listen to others, and to consciously cultivate this Mother's Quest community I'm growing. I'm Julie Neal, and this is Mother's Quest. Elizabeth.
Yes.
Welcome to the Mother's Quest podcast. I have been really looking forward to this conversation. It's so timely and so much for us to talk about. So I'm excited to dive in.
I am too. I'm really thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me.
So I have to first start with just a little bit of an acknowledgement, appreciation moment. I'm not sure how I originally found you. I think it might have been through Amanda Steinberg, who's a friend of yours who was on the show. Also, I think we're both in the She Podcast Facebook group. But I've been following you now for a little while, and you have seriously been one of those guiding lights during this time in our history. I tune in very often to your resistance lives, which have become a phenomenon. And I'm just so appreciative of you. I think you had a post one day where I ended up putting the photo that for me just really captures how I feel about so much of what you say. It was the image of the San Francisco movie critic chronicle guy jumping out of his chair. I don't know if you've ever seen those, but the enthusiasm for the movie is based on where if this guy is like sitting with the hat on his head sleeping or sitting up straight or
awesome.
out of his chair clapping. And there have been, more than one times where you say things that have also been in my heart and mind, and you say it so eloquently and in such a way that it feels really healing to hear you say it and name it. And so just want to start out with that gratitude for you.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I have to say that the interesting thing about where this has come from versus where it is now, and we can talk a little bit about that if you'd like, but I mean, the funny thing about having something go as viral as this has gone is that I'm really mindful, as I always have been, of speaking my mind truthfully. And my assumption has always been for quite some time that if I'm struggling with something, chances are very good that someone in my community is struggling with it as well. And so I do my best to be honest and open, even with, 25,000 people watching me daily right now. And I'm really glad to hear that it resonates because that's really what I'm after more than anything else.
Amazing. So we have a little bit of a time challenge, and I want to make sure that we get through the whole conversation. So let's just go straight to the first question, which is I always like to hear a little bit from our guests about their childhood. So I'd love to hear kind of where and how you grew up, and also who was a mother figure in your life that shaped you and in what ways?
Yeah, so I had a really interesting childhood. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania called New Hope, Pennsylvania, which is about an hour and 15 minutes south of New York City and about 45 minutes outside of Philadelphia. It's sort of like in a little bit of a triangle position to those two major locales. When I was growing up there, it was a very small town. that was incredibly left-leaning. Sometime in the 60s and early 70s, there was a huge theater contingent in Greenwich Village in New York City that decided to relocate out to New Hope and Bucks County, Pennsylvania generally. And one of the things that meant was that when I was growing up in New Hope, about 50% of the population in the town was gay. And there were many, many people on edges of counterculture because the town was so open and progressive. So when I was growing up, I had schoolmates who lived in communes. I had schoolmates whose parents grew like pot plantations in their backyards, basically. I had a few schoolmates, believe it or not, whose parents were in the free love movement, which at the time was really scandalous. And they lived in houses where literally the only door in the house was on their room. And so I was exposed to a lot as a young child that was sort of a little bit edgy, I guess is the way to put it. But the one thing I will say was that that community was always very politically active. And, I was raised by a mother and then a stepmother, both of whom are very left-leaning and progressive. So my mom was very politically aware from a very young age. Like I can remember being in the local library when I was 4 and having my mother like basically yelling at the librarian about the fact that they were carrying children's books that said that boys could be doctors and lawyers and girls could be nurses and teachers and didn't, have any crossover between those two things. We were not allowed to buy grapes in my household when I was a kid because we were supporting Cesar Chavez. There were all sorts of political awarenesses there in that were really eye-opening. And then, when the early 80s hit and the AIDS epidemic decimated my hometown, at that time I was in my early teens, the town itself became radicalized in a way that I had not seen before. There was an AIDS hospice that was opened up down the street from where my father lives, even still. And the town has kind of continued to have a really progressive bent. My dad, who is remarried, of course, to a woman right now and has been for about the last 25 years or so, was a major advocate in his church for the approval of same-sex marriage in the community at the time that became an issue. And, my dad, who's 75, drove people to the polls this past election to vote for Hillary Clinton. So I come from this background that has led me to a very predictable place of political activism. But I'll also add that there were, quite a number of things in my childhood that were not particularly easy. I'm pretty open about the fact that I'm a survivor of child sexual abuse, certainly experienced a lot of gender discrimination in my early years and in my early employment. And many, as I think everybody knows, I was a Wall Street lawyer for 15 years before I started my executive consulting and coaching company. And, certainly had my fair share of experiences in that realm that were not particularly pleasant. So all of that has led to, quite a significant political awareness and activism in my daily life. And so in some sense, even though it's been a little bit surprising how fast what started out as daily political broadcasts that my friends wanted to hear me riff on in January has grown into something of a explosive movement with so many people watching me and, lots of people who are very high profile paying attention to what I'm doing. In some sense, it's also totally predictable given where I came from. So that's a little bit about me and my background.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I can see how that unique way in which you grew up and what you were exposed to has absolutely shaped, the gifts that you bring to all of us and your perspective. And in terms of a mother figure or women who have had an impact on you, who's the one person that comes to mind as having shaped you the most?
Oh my gosh, there's so many. That's a hard question. But I will say that my stepmother, she comes from an interesting background herself because she was raised in a Mennonite family and, very self-identified as Christian. She's also one of the most progressive people I know. And so throughout the time that I was a teenager when she first met and then married my dad, she and I have had some of the most in-depth conversations about religion and tolerance and politics. And, not all of them have been particularly easy, but at the same time, she is a Christian who believes in love as a founding principle and acceptance. And, it's led to my capacity to have difficult conversations sometimes, even with people who might not be exactly where I am or as far to the left. Although she's very left-leaning. So, sometimes those conversations are easy. But, I think that it's one of the things that I talk about a fair amount on the broadcast is the importance of staying open, not necessarily to converting people who are so far opposed to us and so entrenched in their ways that there's no access points, but staying open to having conversations with people who maybe share some viewpoints with us, but aren't exactly on the same page so that we can kind of become arm in arm, not just in our resistance, but also in our growth. And, my stepmother has been an absolutely integral part of that for me since I was 17 or 18 years old.
Wow, that sounds like an exceptional relationship. And some of what you said just now reminds me of something you were talking about on your live yesterday, and that I hope we'll get into in our conversation about the work that's needed, about healing and really making room for conversations, some of which may not always be easy. They won't be easy. And how we think about bringing people to the table and also coming to the table ourselves with some openness and curiosity and compassion.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really hard in the environment that we're in right now with how polarized things have become to let go of our anger. And I'm not suggesting that the anger isn't justified because, so many of the women in my community, for instance, who are women of color, talk all the time about the fact that institutional racism played a huge role in this past election, just in the same way that institutionalized misogyny did, right? And it's hard to forgive, and I'm not suggesting forgiveness is where we should head, but it's hard to not be angry, I guess is the way to put it, when you're faced down with the idea that perhaps this person was elected in part because there's a desire to have somebody white in the office after having had a Black president for 8 years. And with all that said, my viewpoint and one of the things that I shared on the broadcast yesterday was that one of our roles as members of the resistance is that I feel like we are the people who are going to lead us to a better government, a better way of living, a more holistic society and culture in this country that's more accepting of others. And so part of our work, and as I said, I'm not a fan of trying to convert people where there's no access point. There's 20% of the base of the current president that I don't think will ever think he's done anything wrong or, will always support him. But I do think there is something to be said for those who perhaps were swayed in various directions, potentially by the culture, potentially by their upbringing, potentially by, targeted social media posts that, as we now are learning that has happened in the election, who are sort of coming to a new awakening about their views. And, I feel like we have to lead as much as we possibly can. None of us are perfect on this, believe me, from a place of healing if we intend to make a world that we can all live in. And again, this requires us to stretch ourselves in directions perhaps that we have never stretched before. I have learned an awful lot about that myself just in the last 6 months about the importance of making an effort to not be triggered and to engage instead from a place of wanting to understand, even if the understanding leads me to a place of going, I can't accept that. Having an openness of conversation and at least being willing to sit down and listen, which I think, by the way, I think this is one of the things that active social media has made very difficult for us is we're always thinking about the next step, right? Like, what am I going to post in response? How am I going to respond to this? Rather than being present to immediate conversation. And so I feel like there are some skills that perhaps we need to refine and develop. And we also, by the way, need to be very mindful of our own self-regulation because it's really easy to fly off the handle, especially in circumstances that are this volatile, where so many of us feel so unsafe day to day, and that it's a toxic level of stress that we're all living under. And at the same time, we also need to continue to consider what's coming after this and how can we play a role in creating a world that we all want to live in.
That is something I have so appreciated that you continue to talk about, is that we have to be actively not only resisting, which you talk a lot about, but actively holding a vision for and moving into trying to create the world we really want to live in.
Yep.
So I want to do a quick shout out because this is reminding me of a question that was submitted to me by one of the members of the Mother's Quest community and a friend of mine who I was a counselor with at UCLA's family camp that Jen Jenkins Donner.
Yes.
A follower of yours. And I saw she created this amazing piece of art in response to one of your lives that you shared. So I asked her because I knew that she would have a lot of questions. What are some questions that she has for you? She had some great ones. And one, which maybe we'll get to in a little bit, is what is your vision for our country? But she also had some questions about the heroine's journey and the masculine and feminine energy and your own path and what you're feeling called to right now. So I think with that as a little bit of a frame, I want to move into my own quest, why I started this podcast and why I started Mother's Quest, and then begin to ask you about the guideposts that are part of living an epic life. So just as a brief overview, I had a moment in the spring a year ago where I realized that I had these aspirations and dreams and ways in which I wanted to become a fuller expression of who I am that I had not been listening to. And through an experience, sort of a spiritual moment, two birds that got trapped in my house. And there's a whole blog post about that, which I could link to. But I basically decided in that moment that I was no longer going to allow myself to not answer this call that I was feeling. And I moved into, with 100% of my whole focus, launching this vision for Mother's Quest. And when I was trying to think about, well, what is it that I'm really after? I realized that what I want is to live an epic life. So resonating very much with the idea of the hero's journey, but wanting to have my own feminine perspective on it, that I felt like I want to be able to fill my life with the things that matter most, do the things that I want to create that might feel scary, but to be courageous in it. And really grow myself to be the best person I can be, not only for myself, but also so that I can be an example for my children. I have two boys, and I know that they learn more from what they see in us, not from what we just tell them.
Right.
So this idea of an epic life absolutely captures the, kind of a heroic journey. Also, it's an acronym mnemonic for the guideposts that I believe help us to live that life in the years when we're raising our children. So E stands for engaged, and that's about being engaged mindfully with our kids. P is passionate and purposeful work in the world that's beyond our family. I stands for invested in ourselves, and C is connected, that we're in community on our journey. So I'm going to ask you about how those guideposts are showing up for you. But first, I want to come back to this question from Jen. I'm curious to know if you feel like you're on a hero or heroine's journey of some sort, how you frame that for yourself and what your current calling is.
Yeah, gosh, that's such a good question. And it's a little funny that you're talking about it because, the last 2 times that I've done major public speaking events, and I do a lot of public speaking, but ones where I was like in the room with 150 great women leaders, what I've talked about is the journey of the new heroine. So this is all very near and dear to my heart. And I have a number of friends who, have degrees from Naropa and the like, who have really studied mythology and who I've spoken to in depth about the process of the hero's journey and then how the heroine's journey kind of maps onto that. One of the things that I find really interesting about the idea of a heroine's journey is that in the traditional masculine model, the hero goes through a whole series of challenges and then he comes back to his community and offers a big boon to the community, which they can choose whether or not to accept. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But that's sort of the end goal. I feel like the interesting thing about the feminine energy of the heroine, and there are plenty of new heroines, by the way, who we're seeing right now, like Sally Yates, Kamala Harris, right? Elizabeth Warren, that are out there just working so hard to save our democracy and to really take women's leadership in the political sphere to whole new levels. But one of the things that I think is really interesting about our journey, perhaps as women, that's different from the traditional hero's journey, is that I feel like with every step of what we learn along the way, we are bringing that back. My experience day to day, by the way, when I'm doing these broadcasts of Resistance Live, is that there are things that are triggered in my consciousness, whether it's about my daily experience, with my children, in my community, in my business, in my interactions with my clients, that gets me thinking about something that is reflected in the larger culture. And that usually forms the foundation of like the last 5 minutes of the broadcast, because I do my best to leave everyone with something that they can take home and really, ponder, consider, apply in their own lives, ideas of how to continue going. And I really do my best to keep pushing people forward, in part because I think the only way we fail is if we give up. And this is a time in history where if we give up, the consequences will be tragic. So my experience of that journey, so to speak, myself, is that, ironically enough, the last 9 months for me, really since the election and a little bit before, have been very transformative in my personal life. My marriage came to an end. I moved out with my children. I'm now a single mother of 2 kids under the age of 5. And there are lots of lessons that have come along with that, while the intimate details of those are not necessarily important to the greater community that I serve, the experience of where I find myself in the day-to-day shares some commonality. And it definitely informs what I seek to bring back to my community through each challenge or phase of my journey that I pass. And so, it's really resonant with me, that idea. And I wouldn't say I'm on a heroine's journey that is any different than the journey that I've been on for my life, because I am one of those people who, since I was a young girl, really had the very strong intuition that I was here to make a massive difference on the planet. I didn't know how I was going to do that at every step of the way. so there is the journey and the trajectory of my life that has led me to where I am right now. And, but at the same time, the last 9 months in particular, just as for many of us, they feel like they've gone by incredibly fast and we've aged in dog years. They have certainly felt to me like a massive acceleration of purpose and mission.
Yeah. There's something that you said that resonated. Well, all of what you said resonated. And I love this idea of the frame of the new heroine's journey and every step bringing back those lessons. That's something I'm really committed to doing on the podcast and in my Facebook group and my blog posts, just continually sharing the reflections and learnings that are coming up for me. But when I first launched the podcast, my podcast opening said something like, I realized that I need to be the hero of my journey now. And when I started season 2, it didn't feel right to me anymore. So I went back and re-recorded that to say that I now realize I'm the hero of my journey. That I have been all along. And it's not like it's just a one-time deal that you just come back and you're done. It really is a constant evolution.
Right. And, it's funny, I'm in a couple of women's circles very deep. This is one of the things I do to support myself when we get to the I. But, one of the things that we talk about is the fact that learning, especially in communities of women, is cyclical rather than linear.
Yeah.
So we're always, if you think of it as a spiral, we're circling back around again and again to things that we touch upon in our lives and lessons that we need to learn, and things get refined and shaped and curated, for lack of a better way of putting it, in the way that we learn and we share with one another. And that to me is one of the greatest gifts of leading a community that's largely made up of women, is that sharing is continuous. And it's not just me sharing to the community, which is something else that I always want to reiterate. I get as much out of doing what I'm doing as I hope the people that I'm serving do. And I am held up and supported as much as I'm holding up and supporting others. And I feel like that's also one of the things that is happening right now in culture when we look at women's leadership, is that hierarchies are very different than what we might have perceived them to be in the past. And we are much more shoulder to shoulder than we might have ever recognized.
Amazing. Well, before we move into the guideposts, being aware of time, I want to also tell you a little bit about what's part of my quest and journey right now that I'm grappling with, that I know that you'll have a lot to share. So we can go deep there, and then we can go into the guideposts after that. So I did send you an email the other day. I think you shared with your community on your feed just one of the videos, but I've been on my own quest of becoming more awakened to, and just really allowing myself to feel the emotions of what it might be like to be a Black mother of boys. And I have a friend, Genji Heiston. She's a member of my founder circle. She and I did a podcast episode about this. She posted a little over a year ago a Facebook Live in tears after another Black man had been killed from a police officer, about what it feels like to literally fear for your husband and your brothers and your children every day when they walk out the door. And how it was a call to white women that she felt like, what we need to do is we need to actually get in touch with what it would feel like if those were our children. And that was how we were experiencing our day. And it really struck me, and I reached out to her, and we ended up having a conversation, and we've been in continual conversation about what can be done. And so recently, when the officer who killed Philando Castile was acquitted, and I first saw a video of Diamond Reynolds, who was the girlfriend, in the back of a cop car with her 4-year-old daughter, she in handcuffs, them just having experienced their loved one being murdered for no reason. And just this little girl saying to her mom, "Don't yell. I don't want you to get shot, and I'll protect you." I mean, I am crying now just thinking about it. It's just horrifying. And so as a mom, there is just no way that I can continue to see that and not move into some action. Right. Knowing that any action I take is going to feel small, or it might be imperfect. And for the longest time, I've been afraid to even be vocal, or even to share posts on my feed, or say anything for fear of judgment on either side. Like, I'm going to get it wrong. I won't do anything. And I just hit my own internal level of intolerance for that. So what I've committed to doing, I have this idea, and I'm really wanting to welcome people in to help me shape it. But this idea of doing at least one special episode on the podcast where I can really learn from ideally a Black mother and a white mother that have both been activists in this area, learn more about how I can be a better ally, learn more about how I could talk to my children about this, because I'm raising two white men that I want to be aware and I want them to grow up being allies. And then I figured, since I have my own platform, I could invite my listeners to learn as well, and for us both to contribute to some causes that really get at this. I also then want to invite other people with platform, other women podcasters, to do the same. And then I figure at the end of that, I could have this incredible resource of links to all kinds of powerful conversations that people that want to learn can go to. And then I'm also a community builder and a facilitator, and I want to be able to facilitate conversations like these. So in the Bay Area, I'm committed to doing like a community dinner and circle, again, where we could invite in some mothers that are already working in this area to share what they have been doing, and for us to begin to talk about, even if it feels uncomfortable, have some of those conversations and make some commitments. So I'd love your quick feedback about that. And then I know that this is all touching on this idea of intersectionality, which is a term that has been coming much more to the forefront and is one that you talk a lot about. Maybe you can sort of define that and just give me a few words of wisdom about how I might move forward with this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a brilliant idea. And I will say that it's also been a part of my commitment in the communities that we serve, very much so really for the last, I'd say, 5 years. Although, at this moment in time, those conversations are happening, much more frequently than what I've seen in the past, and with a lot more courage than I've seen in the past. And it's extraordinary to witness. We had a moment, we do an annual conference every year called Gaia Women Lead, that's for activist women in leadership, whether they're in corporate or elsewhere, or entrepreneurship. And we had a moment at this year's conference where a very dear friend of mine, she and I were pregnant at the same time with our first children, and she is Black. Her son is Black, of course. And she had a conversation about how her viewpoint as the mother of a Black son informs everything that she thinks about in the context of the current political realm. And she has not yet had that hard conversation with him about how to deal with a police confrontation. She said in very intimate and painful terms, I was crying on the stage while she was doing this, fielding the question, about how she wants to preserve his innocence for just a little bit longer before having to have that conversation with him. And the interesting thing was that in the room at that moment, another woman who was there, who is white, put her hand in the air and looked at my friend. See, now I'm going to cry. We talked about this before we got on because, but she looked at her and said, we as white feminists have failed you. And we have not done our job to be as mindful of the impact of race on everything that we are experiencing as we should have been. And I'm sorry. And it was one of the whole room was in tears, and I'm shortening it. It was a very heartfelt and painful moment, I think. And also one that when that particular panel wound down, and we have photographs of this, there were hugs and tears and, reconciliation, even in the smallest of ways, in a room of 75 women, that brought us all to a new level of awareness. And I hope for my friends who were there, who were women of color, at least a new sense of community that perhaps, created a small zone of safety that may not exist in everyday life. And so, to me, the issue of intersectionality is the issue of finding ways of this movement that we're calling the resistance being one that is representative of all of us. What that means is that, for instance, because much of my community is very deeply feminist, thinking about the ways in which certain and again, feminism is diverse as the women who are in it, but that certain angles of feminism have not been really very good at being intersectional. There is certainly like a white woman of privilege version of feminism, just like there's a kind of white working class version of feminism. And just like there's a radically empowered Black female version of feminism. There are all of these angles, but the forward facing part of many women's movements in the past has not represented all women. And, part of that has been about privilege, right? About not being aware of the ways that our skin color or our gender identity or our, sexual orientation allowed us to get into rooms perhaps that other women could not get into, right? And so for me, a lot of this is about being willing to have difficult conversations, being willing to investigate our own internal biases. And this is really hard work. I say to everyone when I talk about this, that I feel like this is not easy, right? It is not easy for any of us to look at the ways in which institutionalized biases in our culture have given us things simply because of, the bodies we were born into. Right. And to me, this is one of the most necessary things of where we find ourselves in our culture right now. If we do not confront the need to be representative and welcoming to everyone, regardless of where they come from, regardless of their orientation, regardless of their gender identity, regardless of their race, regardless of their immigration status, regardless of what they believe. If we do not confront the need to create a culture where everyone is safe, starting with ourselves, right, then we're going to end up where we are now for a long, long time to come. And I think we got a little, and I don't blame, I'm very mindful, especially given all of the things that we're learning now about collusion, of not blaming left-leaning movements, necessarily for what happened in the election. There was a lot of interference and a lot of things went down. But I will say that what I hear a lot from white progressive women is that we got too comfortable. And so part of how we move forward, again, is we have to be willing to listen. I'm a very big believer, by the way, in nonviolent communication strategies, which allow us to hear and communicate what we value and listen in return in ways that don't put us on the defensive or people that we're talking to on the defensive. And, I also just feel like we have to be willing to create spaces for those conversations to happen. And that's one of the things that we've been trying to do at the Gaia Project for Women's Leadership for as long as we've been around. And I feel like we need to do our own internal work. And when we change the internal, we change the external. And that allows us to walk into rooms which maybe previously would have made us uncomfortable in terms of the tone or nature of the conversations, and be willing to be okay with what we hear and learn, right? And to be willing to filter it and reflect it back through our own experience and bear witness also, because by the way, that's a big chunk of it. I think what you talked about in terms of the experience of being a Black mother, experiencing fear every time a son, a brother, a daughter for that matter, like a father leaves the home, that is an experience that we should all be bearing witness to, because if we are not bearing witness to it, we are not understanding what needs to change, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, this is an issue that to me feels very integral to the future of our nation and to the future of our culture in general, is a willingness to sit and have conversations with people who don't look like us or don't have the same life experience as we do and find commonality.
And if you were to offer like one word of wisdom about what helps you to do that, to be in that space, to move into that discomfort, what would you offer?
Well, I will say I feel like I have a little bit of a benefit here because I live in Brooklyn, which is incredibly diverse, right? And I have had, hijabi Muslim neighbors for as long as I can remember, and, a very racially integrated neighborhood, albeit fairly privileged. It's certainly hard to live in my neighborhood in Brooklyn if you don't have a certain degree of income. But what I will say is that I have made a point, for instance, as an entrepreneur of, and, this is something that I think I can offer not just to entrepreneurs, but honestly to anybody who's living in community, of seeking out different voices in everything that I do. Meaning that, if I'm organizing a panel for one of our conferences, I am looking at it from a place of representation, right? I am considering whether or not we look too white. And, if we're getting feedback, which has happened from time to time when we've organized things of like, you don't have enough cross-representation on the panels that you're advertising for this particular conference you're running, we're like, you know what, you're right. And let's see what we can do to fix that. From the individual standpoint, what I will say is that I feel like it is more important now than ever that we get to know the people who live around us, and that we make a point, if we are living in non-diverse communities, of reaching out to others in our realm who, maybe are underrepresented in the total population, but, are still our neighbors, right? Right. And I will say that I've even had some people who live in largely white places reach out to me and say, I want, for instance, to go visit a mosque. How would I go about doing that in a way that would be respectful? Mm-hmm. And, the Council of American Islamic Relations is out there. CARE does great work, and they are all about dispelling bias and prejudice and creating bridges instead of barriers between white Americans and Muslim Americans. So, I feel like that some of this is about setting the intent that you are going to be a member of your community in ways that create value in diversity. And that may mean that, you've got neighbors across the street that you've never talked to who don't look like you, and you show up with a plate of cookies, right? That in and of itself can be bridge building. So I think it is about intent. And, this is the other thing I want to say about it just in passing, is that I know that a lot of the blowback that I've heard from a lot of different angles sometimes is this is all about white guilt. That to me is not what any of this is about. What this is about is understanding that diversity is what makes us strong and what makes us powerful and what makes us value human life in general, right? And so if we are not consciously cultivating communities and workplaces and businesses and governments that represent all of us, we are not going to be as successful, as powerful, as integrated, as understanding as we might be otherwise. And there are all sorts of reasons. I do a lot of work in corporate around unconscious bias. There are all sorts of stats I could share with you here about all the differences that it makes. But the fundamental issue here is that if we are not valuing what everyone brings to the table, we're underselling ourselves as a nation, as the human race, fundamentally. And so I feel like intentional efforts, even in the smallest of gestures, make a massive difference here and ripple out across, our communities, our towns, our nation, our world in ways that truly do make a difference. And every one of us has a role to play in that.
I really appreciate that. And I feel like that's something for other people who are listening that, maybe aren't going to do what I just named that I'm going to do. They could do what you just said. They could think about somebody in their own neighborhood, in their own community that they could reach out to. So, I'm clear that I could have like a total part 2, and maybe you'll be open to
maybe we will. Yes, absolutely. I'm totally open.
So I'm going to try something that I've never tried before, which is a little bit more like a lightning round.
Let's do it.
Checking in on the guideposts. Normally, we really go deep for quite a while on each of these guideposts, but if we do it more succinctly, when I mentioned E about engaging mindfully with your children, what is the thing that emerges immediately to you as what you've learned or what you do to really connect with your children?
Yeah. So this is a big lesson that's very recent. As you know, because of all the work that I'm doing related to the resistance, like I'm online all the time when I am not with my kids. And one of the big lessons that I've learned is really that period of time from when I pick them up from school until they go to bed has to be really a time where I am only focused on them. And so I do my best to put the phone down for those few hours. And I even have it blocked out in my calendar now as happy kid time.
I love that.
So I can be present for them and give them what they need, just emotionally. And, by the way, it's also really joyful for me when it goes successfully and I don't end up having to be like, get to bed, and able to be more present just to their experience of what's happening.
Right. Actually, through this interview, I've been hearing the pinging of your phone.
I know.
Those are notifications that you're probably getting. That's probably what your day is like because there's so many people that are following you and wanting to connect with you. I really appreciate this. This is something I've been struggling with too. So it's a great reminder. And I had an episode, the first episode of this season with Kathleen Shannon, where her challenge to me was to be more mindful about my ideal week, and to use Google Calendar to really block things out. So now you've inspired me to go back to that Google Calendar I've started and really block out those afternoon and evening hours for the same purpose with my kids. Thank you.
Yeah.
P, passionate and purposeful, the work you're doing in the world.
Yeah. It's funny to me even still, I've been an activist my whole life. I could track back to kind of like the age of 15 when I engaged in my first active protest. But what I will say is that I think a lot right now about the unique position that I am in because I was a lawyer and I have legal training and I understand what's happening on the Hill and in our government and in investigations in ways that the layperson does not. And I also simultaneously have a really clear lens on holistic models of leadership and women's leadership. And it's put me in a really unique position in relation to just what's happening right now in our nation. And the interesting thing about this has been true of me for some time, that my work has not felt like work since I left Wall Street. Running my company and doing the leadership work that I do, both in corporate and virtually, is so easy for me in some sense. Not in the day-to-day in terms of execution of it, but in terms of it never drains me, right? But what I will say is that where I am right now, I'm a part of a forward motion that feels to me like I am integrated in the force of it. I'm sort of swimming with the current, and also part of the force behind it. And that is unique to me. I'm very very much on purpose right now, is I guess the way to put it, whether that's intentional or whether that's about my purpose in life. And it's a uniquely powerful place to live. And I just hope that the work that I'm doing in the long run is going to make as much of a difference to other people as it's made to me.
So powerful. I love that imagery. Is there one thing that you feel like you shifted that helped you be more on purpose?
Well, I'll tell you this, like the willingness to let go of things that don't make sense anymore, especially from a business standpoint, has been huge. And that goes for programs, for instance, that my company has run in the past that maybe have made us hundreds of thousands of dollars, where we're looking at that right now and saying, you know what? That worked really well when we were just talking about women's empowerment, but where we are right now is in a place where activist leadership makes so much more sense. And so how are we going to serve the community that's in front of us now to get where we want them to go and where they want to go, even if it requires us to just chuck everything that we've done before and start from scratch with brand new programming. So I feel like, we're in a place right now where the importance of releasing things that no longer serve us is huge. And holding on to things that don't serve us is really detrimental. Like it's the experience of having like cinder blocks around your ankles, right? Yeah. So being willing to cut loose, old stuff and, with a very much from a position of gratitude, thank you, right? Thank you for all of that. And onward we go, onward and upward has really helped a lot.
So good. I invested in yourself.
Yeah. So let me just tell you, when you're in front of 25,000 people every day and you're a single mother of 2 kids and you're running a massive worldwide business, like investing in myself has never become as important as it has in the last 9 months. So I'm really fortunate, and again, I have to say this, I speak to this from a position of privilege, even though I have built my entire business from the ground up and I've never had investors or taken money from anybody else. Like it's all been me charging toward the end game. But I'm really lucky to have an incredible team of practitioners of all sorts in my support network. I have an acupuncturist. I have someone who showed up in my life 6 months ago and said, let me personally train you for free because I feel like your physical health is going to be critical to what you're trying to do in the world. And she's just a rock star. I have, a parenting coach that I work with on a regular basis to help me refine stress around my kids and the transition that we're moving through as a family right now. I have a nonviolent communication coach that I work with that, works with me on communication and all sorts of other things. And then I also am very deeply invested right now in the importance of women in community with other women. So for the last 2 years, I've been in a very tight women's mastermind that is actually, it's global. We have, it's 8 women, but we're all over the world. And those are really the people who know everything there is to know about me and to whom I can turn with anything and know that they've got my back. And so all of that is investment in self. But I also just want to say to everybody out there who maybe doesn't have the same degree of resources that I have, that to me, one of the things that we need to remember as a movement right now is that every gesture that we take of self-honoring is reflected back in what we can give to other people. So if we are not taking the pause for ourselves at the end of the night, and for a long time for me, this was just let me put my kids to bed and get in an Epsom salt bath, right? That gesture of I'm taking 10 minutes to just honor my day and where I am and, that I've made it through allows us to keep going to give back to other people and particularly as mothers, right? So, my routine right now, my life right now is so busy and wild and, I feel 1,000 private messages a day right now and multitudes of emails. I'm really fortunate that I've got the team behind me that I have, but I've never been more aware of the importance of not self-care from the point of mani-pedis, right? Self-care from the point of spiritual and physical health, right? As being a foundational principle of self-value. And by the way, for any of us who have grown up, as vulnerable communities, whether we're women or we're people of color or, we're LGBTQ, my view on this is that what we need to take the perspective that we are worth the effort of self-honoring and deep self-care, right? The powerful gestures of maintaining our bodies and our health and our wellness and our connection to others as a way of reinforcing that the messages that we were given during the time that we were growing up were utterly false. And we have the capacity to combat that from the inside out and do it for other people.
Wow. I'll link in the show notes to the interview that I did with Paula Mendoza, who is one of the organizers of the Women's March, where she referenced, when I asked her about this guidepost, she referenced that Audre Lorde quote.
Yes.
About self-care is active political warfare.
Yep.
C, we're at the last guidepost, connected. You've referenced this a little bit already.
Yeah. The one thing I will say that I think about a lot these days is this issue of mirror neurons in the limbic brain because so much of my work is done on social media now. And it's very easy. My entire corporate team is virtual. So we don't work in an office. We're online together and we have, team meetings over Zoom and elsewhere. But I have to be very mindful, particularly of getting face to face with people who care about me and who I care about for the sake of creating connection that isn't just virtual, right? And so one of the things that I do for myself and that I really do recommend for others is that you don't forget your immediate, right? You don't forget whether that's your family or your friends or your neighbors, that, the resonance that we find in one another when we're sitting across from each other having a meal, can't be overstated. Like, it's so important that we take the time to connect in those ways as much as it's important that we take the time to connect, if you're me, with like the masses every day also. And I feel like the intimate connection in one-on-one spaces, with friends, with partners, with our kids is something that is really easy to back burner in today's environment and with the technology we have accessible to us. And to me, it's the thing that we probably should not forget about the most.
Yes. All of these points are resonating and things I've been learning and coming back to myself. All right. Well, I liked that fast round of the EPIC guideposts. Those were amazing nuggets and really helpful things that have been resonating for me. We're at the point now before I always end every podcast episode with acknowledgement of what each of us are taking away from this reflective time together. But before we do that, the other thing that every guest does is offer to me and then anyone else who's willing to come along some kind of a challenge or an offering or something that will support the themes that we were discussing.
Yeah, in thinking about this, and I had some ideas before I came on, and I'm heading in a different direction now with all of this, in part because I'm really inspired by the fact that you have decided to use your platform in a particular way that lends itself to intersectional and difficult conversations around race and also creating space and connection through that. The thing that I am continuously reminded of in the work that I'm doing right now is the importance of every single one of us using our voices. And I hear from a lot of women who, as a result of this election in particular, are saying, I was never an activist before now. I've never called my representative. I've never spoken up at a town hall meeting or, had a meeting in my house where I talked about the things that really mattered to me in our political environment and in our government. I think the most important challenge that I would want to issue to anyone is to think about ways in which you can stretch yourself to use your voice for good. Because the thing that has been proven to me time and time again throughout all the work that I've done, and particularly over the last 6 months, is that one person can make a difference. And the collective of each of us, if we believe in using our voices as individuals and as a collective, the difference that can make is world altering. So I would just encourage those of you who maybe haven't thought about using your voice for change to think about what a stretch for you. And, I'm also a coach, and I always say I want to stretch and not a hamstring tear, but what a stretch outside of your comfort zone would feel like for you to take the conversation that you are having right now, maybe in your own head or maybe in your own home, to the next level with an understanding that you as a single person can change the world, even if it's just the ripple effect of the difference you can have on one other human being.
Great. Thank you. And so I feel like I have a vision for that, but I will continue to step into that and be thinking about, as I move through this, how I can continue to stretch and yet not pull a hamstring.
Right.
I like that. Are there any particular articles or resources or tools or things that could guide us in how to do that?
Well, let me just say that, I mentioned before that we've chucked out all of our old content for the rest of the year as an organization. We're actually going to be running a leader/activist bootcamp at my company this fall, where one of the primary topics is actually going to be about using your voice. So, I know you're going to share my info with your audience and the like, but that's really going to be an opportunity for people who are considering what it means to be an activist in any realm that they're operating in, whether that's politically or at work or in their community or at home, to think about how to use their voices. And so, I just encourage people to kind of follow along as we head in that direction. That program is going to start on October 15th, and we're opening registration shortly before the 1st of August. But, in addition to that, what I will say is what I find interesting about where we are right now as a movement and as a community and as a culture when it comes to women's leadership is that new and great communities where women are really supporting other women to step forward are being grown all the time. It's happened on my Facebook feed. I follow Amy Siskind. She's another major voice of the resistance. She keeps lists of authoritarian behavior for every week since the election. And she she's another person who really started out, doing this as a way of sort of recording what was happening for her own awareness and her own mental well-being. And it has grown into a movement as well on her page. We all kind of know each other now, but there's a lot of encouragement for women to run for office or for women to step into their own voices in new ways. And I don't think there's a part of me that says, we can all do a lot of reading about this. And there are books that have been written about women's empowerment for, 20 or 30 or 40 years now. And it's also really important for us to find people who support us in our actual lives, who push us in that direction. So, I'm just a big fan of stepping into community and putting it out there and seeing what comes back to you. And I feel like that's one way to really make a major push forward in that, is to say, I'm thinking about doing X. Where would I start with that?
Yes. Okay. That feels really good, because that's what I'm in the process of doing now, is just sharing these ideas I have with openness with as many people as I can, and trying to get feedback and guidance and support to move forward. Thank you for being part of that. Such an incredible gift to have this time to talk about it with you. So, now it's time for closing, and I'll start with some acknowledgments for you, some things I'm taking away. So many. I feel like we packed so much into this time together. One thing for sure, I'm continuing to evolve my own picture of the hero or heroine's journey and my role in that. And I really just love this idea of the new heroine's journey and seeing myself among those new heroines and the cyclical nature of it. You just articulated something that I had been thinking about in such a great way, that I'm, constantly coming back and not waiting for finding that magic elixir and bringing it back, but what are the little things I'm finding all along the way and sharing that with people. I really value everything that you talked about, conversation, but truly listening, being willing to listen and doing it in a way that is not confrontational, like those principles of nonviolent communication. The importance of self-honoring and care, and how that actually goes up exponentially the more we want to give. And just this notion of consciously cultivating. I think that term is something that I'm going to be holding for the work that I'm doing with the Mother's Quest community.
That's great.
Thank you so much for this gift. What's coming up for you?
I'll just say that I feel like there's, what I want to reflect back to you is just your bravery. Because it's not easy to decide to bring forward difficult conversations. And there's lots of people, as you said, who maybe have not stepped into that space in the past because for fear of doing it wrong or offending, or coming from a place that maybe doesn't have a degree of self-awareness that informs the conversation in a particular way. And, I feel like we are all being called right now to new levels of bravery, right? I think about this a lot just in the context of what I'm faced with in my day-to-day all the time right now. Every single time that I wake up in the morning and there's 600 new people following my feed, that like the space that I hold now, I'm holding space for a lot more people than I've ever held space for before. And that requires a certain degree of bravery also. So I just want to shout out that, the choice and the intention to talk about things that have not been talked about before requires a great degree of courage. And I hope you recognize that in yourself.
Thank you very much. I do. Yeah. There's seeds that I'm planting. I've been saying that I'm growing an activist muscle, which I never had before. And when I interviewed Paola, the Women's March organizer, way back, and she talked about, standing for the things we value, and I was more comfortable with that. But she also said, but sometimes you also need to resist and stand against things. And at the time of that conversation, the idea of feeling like I was connected to something that would be named resistance, it felt very foreign. And now I'm like, I need to be part of the resistance. So I see that bravery growing in me.
That's great.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Continuing to be connected. I'm going to be seeing you in August in the Bay Area at your events. And I need to learn more from you, from all that you're putting out. And we will absolutely include links to all the ways that people can reach you and learn from you.
Great. Thank you so much. This has been a pleasure. A real wonderful conversation. I'm happy to be a part of it.
Have a great day, Elizabeth.
You too.
Thank you so much for coming along with me on this episode of the Mother's Quest podcast. I hope this conversation sparked something that will help you live your epic life. If you'd like to get show notes and learn more about how to join the Mother's Quest community, head over to mothersquest.com. And while you're there, I would love it if you would follow the prompts to subscribe, leave a review on iTunes, and help us spread the word. I want to end with some words to light the way on your quest. Seize the day, love your people, honor your gifts. Until next time.